Right. Hello, my name is Rose Spickler. I'm the director of the Michigan Sustainable Business Forum, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to today's webinar. I'm joined by our engagement manager, Wesley Watson. Michigan Sustainable Business Forum promotes business practices and public policy that advance climate leadership, community resilience, social justice, and the creation of a circular economy. It is a program of West Michigan Sustainable Business Forum based in Grand Rapids with satellite offices in Southwest Michigan, the Great Lakes Bay region, and the Lakeshore. Today, we're very excited to host a briefing on the Justice40 Initiative, the whole of government effort to ensure that federal agencies work with states and local communities to ensure that at least 40% of the overall benefits from federal investments in climate and clean energy benefit the communities most impacted by pollution and climate change. This is the first of a series of online briefings and in-person town halls for Michigan business and community leaders in partnership with the Environmental Defense Fund and the Climate Action Campaign's Act Now campaign. Our next event is on Tuesday, August 24th from 12 to 1:30 p.m., a Climate and Community Development Forum with Congressman Pete Meyer, hosted at the Rapids Central Station. Please sign up soon for this free event because we are likely to be at capacity soon. And if you would like to learn more about this campaign and how local business and community leaders can support environmental justice and community development as a necessary part of the decarbonization of our state's economy, please send a note to myself or Wesley via the chat or directly to Wesley's email. We also encourage you to share any thoughts on today's program via social media today with the Act Now hashtag. Now I'd like to introduce our presenter for the program today. Please welcome LaTricea Adams, founder, CEO, and president of Black Millennials for Flint, a national grassroots environmental justice and civil rights organization with the purpose of bringing like-minded organizations together to collectively take action and advocate against the crisis of lead exposure in African American and Latinx communities. An appointee to the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, Adams is based in Memphis, Tennessee, where she leads national initiatives and local programs serving Flint, Memphis, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. LaTricea, thank you for being with us today. The screen is all yours.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to go ahead and hop right in. I'm really excited to talk about the Justice40 Initiative. I know there is quite a bit of intrigue surrounding this, so I hope that I, no pun intended, give this presentation just today. So I will first like to speak a little bit more about Black Millennials for Flint before we segue into the Justice40 Initiative. So just to give you a little bit of clarity around how we operate. So Black Millennials for Flint is a fairly new nonprofit organization. Within our namesake, we were established in the wake of the Flint water crisis. We initially started, like many people, just trying to get resources, of course, water to the city of Flint, but then realized that there were several environmental justice issues that are pervasive, not just in Flint, but in majority Black and Brown cities across the country. And so from the inspiration of the fighters in the city of Flint who are still fighting for environmental justice, we started this national movement. So as mentioned earlier, from a national perspective, we have achieved many victories, but a lot more to come from a federal level, so national level as it relates to environmental justice policy. And we're able to articulate that into the community with our grassroots, boots on the ground initiatives, specifically in our 4 core cities, which will be expanding. But as of right now, our 4 areas being Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Maryland, our nation's capital, and of course, Flint, Michigan. So I'll go ahead and get us started talking about the Justice40. I'd also like to say that my representation, or the hat that I'm wearing for today, is that of Black Millennials for Flint. While I am so grateful to be a White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, isn't that a mouthful? A WEJAC appointee, I will be speaking from the lens of just my role as an environmental justice organizer and leader. So giving just a bit of a briefing about the Justice40 Initiative. So essentially with the environmental justice movement, in the spirit of transparency, this movement actually predates the Biden administration. There, even before the terminology environmental justice was coined by our father of the environmental justice movement, Dr. Robert Bullard, and the mother of the environmental justice movement, our great ancestor, Hazel Johnson from Chicago, the work had been happening because we've seen disproportionate issues in Black and Brown communities, extensive bouts with environmental racism that happen again and again and continue to happen. So with the Justice40 Initiative, while there is lots of focus on resources that will funnel into Black and Brown communities, I also would like to frame this with taking back the narrative of the environmental justice movement that was actually started by Black and Brown people. Actually, this year in October will mark 30 years since a very historic convening took place in Washington, D.C. With the environmental justice delegation, where the 17 principles of environmental justice were crafted. And if you're not familiar, I'll make sure that I share a link that gives further insight and historical context around those 17 principles. And so with the Justice40 Initiative, a lot of the work done by my elders and unfortunately ancestors now is grounded in those principles that should govern our work in the environmental space. So getting that preliminary info out, the Justice40 Initiative was established. President Biden, he moved very quickly. This is representative of the promises that he gave on the campaign trail while he was still seeking candidacy. With the Justice40 Initiative, it aims to, one, encourage the federal government to stop working in a silo effort, but work from an interconnected, intersectional perspective, as we know that environmental justice is very much so representative of the social determinants of health, with one thing building upon the other. And so one of the main goals was to deliver at least 40%, hence the Justice40, 40% of resources and investments in climate and clean energy. And I would also like to add in there environmental justice, specific to those communities that are historically disenfranchised, which we, if we don't know, Black and Brown communities are the most at risk. In addition to that, some other key aspects of this initiative includes, again, incorporating multiple agencies with implementation of Justice40. And so part of that is preparing for accountability. It is very clear that it will be quite a mammoth task to ensure that when this funding does come down from our nation's capital, from DC, that it actually goes into the communities in the hands of those people who do live in frontline EJ communities. The other component is the Justice40 pilot. So while I know there are a bit of critics that say this is not enough, you know, we shouldn't just focus on 40%. With any historic initiative, it is very important from a strategy perspective to ensure that it's working with fidelity before going full force and full scale. So the Justice40 pilot program will focus on some preliminary federal agencies with the effort or intention to incorporate those specific initiatives around investments in climate, energy, and also environmental justice. The other component that is really important, which I alluded to a bit earlier, is the accountability and transparency. So one of the things that is often a concern as it relates to funding specifically funding going into Black and Brown communities and being supported or funneling into Black-led, Latinx-led, Indigenous-led environment organizations. There's a lot of red tape. And then there's also has been a history of selective information, meaning that only certain types of people who unfortunately are not always representative of those who are in the most need are sometimes not invited to take part in those opportunities for resources and funding. So another component of the Justice40 Initiative is to ensure that there is clear transparency around the resources that are available to communities of color. So taking this a bit further, I want to spend a little bit of time kind of going through just the overall outline of who or what agencies will be included in the pilot and just some general information about just the programmatic overview. So for example, looking at human services, with the low-income home energy assistance program. If you didn't know, which I know there are many experts on the call today, there are extreme issues in low-income communities as it relates to access to weatherization and energy burden. So for example, I'll use the city of Memphis here in the state of Tennessee, where the energy is actually pretty affordable in general in comparison. However, when you combine that with issues of poverty, where people are unable to maintain the upkeep of their homes, you start to fight against issues with the overconsumption of energy because there's a significant need for weatherization and other energy saving practices in those respective communities. Also, of course, there are several initiatives that stem from the Environmental Protection Agency or EPA. So a focus around diesel emissions reduction. As we know, this is very interconnected. So when you begin to think about redlining, where you see transportation, heavy transportation with highways that run right through local Black and Brown neighborhoods, it's really important that initiative or program is in place because it addresses those issues that are connected both to human health, or what we like to call in the EJ space body burden, and the impact of reducing those emissions are to creating a better quality life and healthier environments for those historically disenfranchised areas. And then also in this last piece, if I can move my little bar up here, with still the EPA, focusing on clean water state revolving funds. So particularly with this program and our initiative, oftentimes the very communities that should be benefiting from existing clean water state revolving funds actually don't go into those areas of need. So don't necessarily go into those frontline EJ communities. And so this connects back to the transparency piece, making sure that there is equitable accessibility for this financing to really get to the heart of establishing not short-term solutions as it relates to clean water, but those long-term solutions. And then for the last part that I'll touch on, if I can get my handy dandy arrow to work, some additional programs. Again, we see the EPA is popular. So this is very much so aligned to the Clean Water revolving fund. So as we think about that funding going to states, it is critical from an accountability perspective that there's priority given to those cities, municipalities, towns, what have you, that include historically disenfranchised communities, as well as identified EJ frontline communities. Also transitioning a bit to a few other agencies that are included in this initial pilot is the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or as we call HUD. There has been recently, even with the previous administration, a significant amount of money that went into lead hazard reduction. However, to maintain that momentum, because we have a myriad of unhealthy homes throughout the country. I even think about, for example, in the city of Baltimore, where there are significant amounts of homes that have not received the proper abatement, where people still are living, which we know those impacts of lead exposure, what that has on all humans. So not just small children, but anyone that comes in contact with lead. Also, a very interesting point is around programming centered with the Department of Homeland Security, where there's a focus on flood mitigation. So when we talk about climate change, we're not just talking about climate change just as an idea, but this really pushes to provide insight on how are we literally going to address the aftermath of extreme weather, for example, where we even see in places like Detroit and other parts of Michigan, where there are significant storms, tornadoes, if you will, where that is not common in the Detroit metro area. So starting to and programming funnily through Homeland Security to address those issues of frequent flooding, particularly in those areas that are not prepared and don't historically have those types of weather patterns. And then I'll end here to talk briefly about the Department of Agriculture. So we have seen very much so the inequity that exists between the suburbs, your urban areas, and rural areas. So with this particular program, really focusing on investing financial support to our farmers, particularly those who reside in or own businesses in rural cities and towns throughout the country. And then also juxtaposed to that is making sure that there's support and incentive for those individuals working in the agricultural sector to make really wise energy choices from an educational perspective, but then actually providing the monetary resources to purchase and sustain the infrastructure to actually manage healthier, cleaner, energy efficient products to help sustain our agricultural practices in rural areas. So I am actually going to, just kidding, one last part. So some of the guidance to the federal agencies. A part of the accountability piece is while these programs are for all Americans, I want to make sure that I emphasize that. I know having the name of an organization like Black Millennials for Flint, we oftentimes get trolled where there is some issues around folks thinking that the advocacy is only for Black people. Please know that the advocacy, the work that is being done with the Justice40 Initiative will literally help everyone in the country. But what is due with even this 40% will not undo the historical treatment of enslaved people as well as Latinx and Indigenous people. So I wanted to make sure that I was firm and stern around that. Another component that you may have began to see is with the transparency component, where there's much more accessibility now to our federal agencies. Historically, there were gatekeepers that kind of kept you away from really reaching those decision makers and high profile influencers within the respective agencies. So that wall is being knocked down. So one of the biggest changes is each respective agency, particularly in these pilot agencies or pilot groups, must engage with the community. One thing that I know for certain working in the environment space is that it's a whole lot of work that needs to be done from the federal government perspective, and the onus should not be on Black and brown organizations like Black Millennials for Flint to convene and educate the general public. It very much so is the responsibility of our federal agencies, who are literally paid to be public servants with taxpayer dollars. So I'm very excited personally and organizationally as it relates to that layer of accountability. So for real this time, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. That was quite a mouthful, but welcome conversation and additional questions surrounding the Justice40 Initiative.
Thank you again. I just want to say thank you again for that amazing presentation. I also want to highlight that we have a Q&A section down. If you have a question, please type it inside the Q&A chat. I do have a few questions here. How can people on a local level help push the Justice40 Initiative?
Yeah, so sorry if it was a little bit of feedback there. One of the things that is really critical is having forums like these. So thank you to you all for setting up this opportunity, but also on the ground at the immediate community level, more than ever, there has to be a collective agenda. And I know that that sounds really cliche, but it is imperative, especially as it relates to Black people, Indigenous folks, Latinx folks, that there has to be unity and collaboration to ensure from the bottom up that there's accountability to local and state officials as it relates to what the anticipation, what the desires are with the Justice40 Initiative. If we as people of color don't get in front of it, then it will be backwards the way that it always has been, or someone will tell us how the money will be utilized as opposed to us as the people who are directly impacted guiding that work. And so I know one of the efforts with Black Millennials for Flint is to convene those spaces with people to, one, educate them. You know, while we have 40 some odd folks like on this call and those who may be experiencing this like streamed, it's really important for this to not happen in a microcosm, but for there to be multiple opportunities of engagement where people have the foundational knowledge on how and what to organize around.
Thank you for that answer. We also have another question from the audience, and it kind of your answer kind of leads into this question. What is or what will be the definition of impact or disadvantaged communities who will receive 40%?
Mm-hmm. So there's actually, if you have an opportunity to, and it's a 90-page document, so you might have to do a search and find, there's a very explicit definition that's provided in the WEJAC recommendations. So specifically as it relates to how we define a EJ frontline community, is somewhat complex. The priority within that definition does include those people who are protected by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So for example, Black people or folks from African descent, Latinx people, and then Native people or Indigenous people who, and it is not even debatable, have taken the brunt and the largest burden from pollution and environmental racism. There's also an economic component in there as well. unfortunately, those same people, but not all, people of color also bear the economic brunt and inequities as it relates to income disparities and accessibility to capital. But also, just in layman's terms, poor people also would be considered as disadvantaged as well. But a key takeaway is the people of color. So making that very clear, that even despite being, for example, a poor white person, there's still the existence of white privilege that those people of color do not have, and that has been used for centuries as it relates to environmental racism. So to get like more of a technical perspective, I would recommend, and I can share this so you don't have to, folks don't have to go through a 90-page document unless you want to, the specific definition for disadvantaged and what describes or defines an environmental justice community.
Thank you for that answer. Another question I have is, we have business leaders on this call, and what roles does business leaders play within the Justice40 Initiative?
Yes, I'm glad that you mentioned that. So there's a lot of opportunity, and we hear this thrown around a lot, but seriously, with workforce development, I would even go as far as to say workforce development, not even from a traditional sense, but even thinking about the impact from a K through 12 perspective. So specifically the recommendations, and I can speak to this, that I made and that were also championed by Black Millennials for Flint, is to not think about how the workforce when people are adults, but how are we working with our youth to ensure that they will be able to get into these positions that we're vying for right now. So that is definitely one thing to think about from a business perspective. The other component is around diversifying your employees. And that means not just focusing on a laborer perspective, but really taking an honest look at your, from an HR perspective, really looking at how is your organization or your business organized? Do you look around you in your boardrooms and you only see white people? Do you only see men? What could you do to bring some of that diversity in more thought-provoking positions? That also is very important. I would also say that now is a phenomenal time if there were interest becoming more efficient, really focusing on energy and conservation, that sometimes can be expensive. I'll be real with that. But it's also a really prime time to think about how you can incorporate quote unquote green initiatives into your existing business model. So there's like a plethora of ways that you can combine the sector of environment with private sector, with businesses and the like.
I also have another question. What role does youth play within the Justice40 Initiative?
Yeah, my favorite group of people. I'm an educator by trade, so it's my favorite people. So good segue. So with youth, it makes me think about back when I was a youth many moons ago, but the whole battle between a healthy battle between W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. I think being from the South, years ago, there was a balance between focusing on higher ed, so attending college, but then also there was a focus on technical or trade. And so when you think about environmental work, for example, all the funding that is anticipated to come down to replace lead service lines, there has to be people that have the physical acumen to be able to do that work. And what we find We saw this in Flint. We see this in Memphis, where it's difficult to find contractors. So one, regardless of color, but then when you put race into the mix, you start to see even greater disparities. So when we think about youth, there's ways to get them, really engaged around this early. It makes me think about, for example, in Shelby County in Memphis, they have introduced what's called Reimagining 901, where they essentially have established academies that really speak to what are the needs from the industry in our city. Who are we preparing our kids to be? What are we preparing them to do so that we can retain talent? And one of those reimagining platforms is around environment. So thinking about how do we build up our young people so that they can sustain and preserve the infrastructure within the city in which they reside. How do we ensure that they are knowledgeable with business sense so they can get contracts? I mean, this is as soon as they graduate, depending on what types of certifications they're trying to get. So definitely there is a lot of work that needs to be done from a curriculum perspective to engage youth. But again, a prime opportunity for the industry, for businesses to begin thinking outside of the box and thinking early. Don't wait until they're like 25 years old. Really getting in there even as early as elementary school. Y'all, our babies are brilliant. So definitely youth engagement opportunities are abound.
Thank you for that. You touched a little bit in your presentation, but accountability. How can we hold our federal agencies accountable to make sure that they implement a lot of these initiatives?
Yeah, so the first thing that is critical is there has to be a universal mechanism to ensure that this money is going into the right hands and into the right or appropriate communities. So I'll use a very specific example. So even with the language that we use to describe programs. So I know even as far back as the early 2000s, there were many local minority business initiatives. Here's the kicker. So when minority, what type, first of all, that is a little bit reductive of a term anyway, but when you say minority, in what way? Are you addressing the underrepresentation of women, which is valid depending on what sector it is, but what type of women? So when you look at construction, for example, a woman of any color would be a minority, but when you start to add an additional layer of Black women, Latina women, Indigenous women, it becomes more narrow. So really adding that specificity around who is captured. And that's why that first question was really important, is who is supposed to be prioritized in this work with these resources is really critical. I hope that I addressed that question. I can keep going.
No, you did. Thank you for that. We're going to have our last question, and this last question is, what advice do you have for predominantly rural states that's laying the groundwork for implementation, thinking of states like North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, and Kansas?
Yeah, so my advice from that perspective is to establish coalitions. And what I mean by that, I'll use Black Millennials for Flint as an example. So we are small, a very small organization. We're young, we're Black. And Latinx, and sometimes folks don't want to listen to us. And so we realize that. We understand the reality of our existence, right? And so what we did is we found some strong allies in this work. So we still didn't change our narrative. We still were and have been very clear in what the specific needs are for the communities that we represent. but we brought in the big dogs. So for example, I think about, we've done quite a bit of work around legislation, both at the federal level and at local levels. And so we bring in the Sierra Club, you know, we bring in EDF, where we bring in like other civil rights organizations like the National Urban League. We bring in those big, quote unquote, top dog environmental organizations to help us to put the pressure on those decision makers. Allies are crucial and critical, especially in underserved, underrepresented states and cities that exist like in North and South Dakota. But that, you know, has been one of the successful areas for us. I would even go as far as to say, like, Flint is a poster child for resilience. Flint is the only thing we knew about with Flint before is that they made cars, right? But Flint rocked this nation, this small suburb outside of Detroit, where they made people listen. And it, you know, took a relentless drive with getting some of those bigger names to stand in solidarity and kind of amplify what those issues are in order to, you know, seek the specific change that is necessary for your particular community.
Thank you for that. We also had a last question that you kind of answered the last question too. It was talking about considering the shared agenda, and you touched on about building that coalition with different organizations as well. As we wrap up, I just want to thank you again. Thank Black Millennials for Flint. I also want to give Black Millennials for Flint, if you have any events coming up that you would like to share out to our business community.
Yeah, so we do have a big weekend actually in store. So this will be our 5th annual Flint Weekend of Service. We did miss a year last year because of COVID, but we're still back in action. We have several events planned, but one that will be live streaming is called a Momney Brunch. And so this particular event is centered on focusing on actually entrepreneurs, so birth workers, so doulas, ancestral birth workers, midwives, where it will be workshop style, essentially providing these individuals with tools and resources so that they can incorporate the political advocacy component into their work, and also support with that messaging to their clients and the childbirthing people that they work with. So that will take place, and I'll try to put it in a box. That will take place on this Saturday, and it begins at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's free to join. If you do join, you'll get a free brunch voucher. So we still will make it work, even though we're in a virtual space, but hope you all will be able to join.
Thank you for dropping that registration link inside the comment box. Again, I just want to thank everybody. We have another event coming up on the 24th, August 24th, I'm sorry. It's our town hall with Congressman Peter Meyer. Please sign up. Registration is getting hectic, so please sign up before it gets to capacity. I want to thank you all again. Thank Black Millennials for Flint. Thank you again to my dear friend, Ms. Adams, for this amazing webinar presentation. We will be sharing all the information out to everybody who was on this call, and thank you again.
Thank you.